Okay, so welcome to today's MLS Home Price Index training webinar. Now, in today's session, we're going to cover a brief introduction on what the MLS Home Price Index, or HPI, is, why it's the best price measure out there, and how realtors like yourselves can use it to your benefit. We'll also go through a brief overview of the dashboard tool, which is available exclusively to members of participating boards. Now, the first and most important thing to know about the MLS HPI is that it can help you with your comparative market analysis, your CMA, but is not intended as a replacement for it. The MLS HPI is going to be a very valuable tool in your toolkit and a reliable and accurate baseline to help you validate your CMA. Now, as a realtor, you're already a market expert in your local neighborhoods. And the MLS HPI provides information on home prices and trends right down to those specific areas, which is going to provide you with the most detailed level of information on home prices and trends. Because, just like every real estate market in Canada is unique, so too are all of the neighborhoods within each of those markets. Now, you already know this, but some of your clients might not. Now, some of you may have had a client come to you in the past and say, well, my neighbor just down the road sold their home 2 years ago at the peak for this amount, so we can probably list my home for just a little bit below that, right? Now, this might not necessarily be true in every case, but how do you actually convince your client that they need to adjust their pricing? Well, the MLS HPI helps by showing exactly what prices are doing in their neighborhood. They might need to price their home higher relative to what it was maybe 6 months ago if the market has seen some price growth, or they might need to adjust their price lower based on their expectations of what they were thinking they could get, so their home doesn't sit on the market for a long time. Now, when we think about the price of a home, how do attributes like the number of bedrooms, the number of bathrooms, the lot size, and a host of other features actually contribute to the price of a home? Well, the HPI does this work and answers that question for you using more than 15 years of MLS system data and sophisticated statistical models. It takes all of this data and uses it to define what we call a benchmark home as the baseline for its price models, which you can think of as a virtual representation of what a typical middle-of-the-road home would look like for a particular property type in a particular neighborhood. And we'll get a little more into the specifics of benchmark homes later on. But for now, I did want to mention that the MLS HPI was developed specifically with realtors in mind. It was established by the resale industry and for the resale industry. So while there are other competing price measures available out there, none of them will do as good a job for you as the MLS HPI. And we release HPI data on the first business day of each month. Again, using data that comes directly from sold listings right from your own MLS system. Now, the HPI is also a constant quality index that provides an apples-to-apples comparison over time. What does that mean? It means that it also enables meaningful month-over-month comparisons in price trends, and it can identify turning points sooner than other price measures. And as I mentioned before, the HPI also goes deeper. It's beyond the usual market level stats. It's going to go all the way down to the neighborhood level, which is going to be the most useful for you when looking at market trends. Now, why should you use the MLS HPI when typically and traditionally most people are already accustomed to using averages and medians? Well, one of the pitfalls of using averages or medians is that they are susceptible to large swings when there are sudden changes to the compositional mix of sales activity. And the way you can think of that statement is like this. Let's say that you take the average height of a classroom of children, and now you invite a professional basketball team into the room, and you take the average height of everyone again. Well, what happens? The average height of the classroom goes way up, but no one's individual height has actually changed. Now, if you dismiss the basketball team and you take the average height again, it drops sharply, but no one has actually shrunk. Now, certain institutions, and of course the media, will frequently highlight average prices to show that housing markets are either crashing or on the verge of a bubble because of how easily they can be distorted by the composition of sales. Now, for instance, you may remember in early 2017, the Canadian average home price rose almost 20% in a very short period, and then dropped more than 15% over the next few months. Now, we already know this was caused by a flurry of high-end sales in the greater Vancouver and Toronto areas entering and leaving the sales mix. But if you only looked at the average price, you'd think that the Canadian housing market had entered bubble territory and then crashed. Now, the home price index is not affected by the composition of higher or lower priced sales that are entering and leaving the sales mix because it is a constant quality measure. And as such, it's not subject to the same volatility as average and median prices. So as a realtor, your main use for the MLS HPI will be to validate your comparative market analysis. However, there are other features that can help you do this, as well as other uses for the price data. So for example, if the listing that you've taken is not similar to a benchmark or typical middle-of-the-road home, you can compare the features of the benchmark home to the features of your listing, and then make the appropriate adjustments to your list price based on the differences in the characteristics of the two. And you can also compare price data across neighborhoods to get an understanding of how trends are evolving in other local areas that you serve, or you can compare benchmark home features for a particular property type across those neighborhoods as well. And finally, you can also compare price trends for different property types, but within the same neighborhood, or compare benchmark home features for different property types within that neighborhood as well. So now we're going to take a look at the HPI dashboard tool. Again, it's available exclusively to realtors from participating boards. And where you can find your local HPI tool is behind, I believe it's the TREB Stratus portal. I don't have access to the login. I don't have I think it's a Clarity or a PropTX ID, but if you check with your local board, they'll be able to let you know where you can find the tool. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on every single feature available in this tool, but I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what you can expect to find and what features are available. Now, the way that you can navigate the tool is through these tabs here at the top, and those will take you through the different features. Now, on the first tab, what we're going to eventually see is just a very simple line chart. The way that you can select data on this, because the great thing about being with CLAR is that you not only have access to the former boards that were recently absorbed into CLAR, you also have access to TREB and Barry as well. So this is sort of the main filter that you can use if you want to narrow it down to a specific board or former board area. But if you leave that unselected, then what you'll end up seeing once you choose property type, let's say we go with two-story detached single-family homes, what you'll end up seeing in the third drop-down is absolutely every major area, municipality, and then sub-area, which is what we call neighborhoods, that is available in the drop-down on the right. So I'm actually going to go just to generic two-story single-family homes. And, I'm just going to choose sort of 3 neighborhoods here at random. I don't think they have much to do with each other, but you hit apply. And then you can see how price trends have evolved for the neighborhoods and the property types that you have chosen. Now you'll notice the axis here is the HPI, and those are index values. And that's excellent for when you want to compare price trends over time because it puts everything on a comparable basis. However, Some people prefer looking at actual price levels. So here at the top of the tool, there's a small toggle. And if you click on benchmark price, now you'll see how price levels actually split out over time. Treb's data goes back to 2000. Everyone else's data starts in January of 2005. But there's a date slider here at the top. So if you want to just drag it up and choose a different starting point and end point as well, you can, of course, do that. And then you'll be able to hover over all the different data points over time and just see how either price levels or price trends have evolved. If we move through the next two features of the tool, you don't have to re-input all of your selections because they carry over. And we're still looking at the same set of data that you selected on the previous tab, but now instead of looking at the entire historical data series, we're just looking at a sort of cross-section. We're comparing how prices have changed relative to the previous month based on the most current data available. And you can switch between other pre-selected points in time. So if you don't want to look versus a month ago, you can, for instance, check versus 2 years ago and other, to see where prices have risen or fallen most. And for those who prefer a more data-oriented approach, we also include everything in a neatly formatted table here. What you'll see in the leftmost column is the most recent benchmark price or HPI value based on what you've chosen. Again, your selections have carried over. And then you'll see data going back for selected points in time. And if you're trying to do an eyeball comparison to see, like, okay, for Smith Township, we're looking at a benchmark price of just over 660, but relative to 12 months ago, 683. So, how much is that? Is that down like 2%, 5% more? We've also included a toggle here at the top where if you click on percentage change, then you'll be able to see at a glance, okay, the most recent benchmark price for this neighborhood and property type is down almost 3% compared to where it was 12 months ago. So basically just a few different ways of slicing and dicing the data. Then you can use some of them or all of them or one of them. It's really up to you. We just wanted to provide as much information as we could in the form of how to visualize the data. Now, the last three features of the tool were actually introduced in the past couple of years, and they were in response to a lot of member feedback that we were getting. And the most common request that we got by far was from realtors who said, okay, so it's great that you have this HPI and I can look at price trends for my neighborhood, but let me just tell you what I have to do as a realtor when I'm doing a CMA. If this is the most recent price that you have with your data, and I have a listing in this neighborhood, I have to go back to, when the listing last sold, let's say it was in April 2017, I have to write down the benchmark price, then I have to calculate the percentage change between those 2 points, and then apply that percentage change to my previous sold listing price, and then I have to do that every single time I'm doing a CMA. So what we introduced here with this price estimator tool is basically just a very simple calculator that does that work for you. So and in this list, of course, there's going to be thousands of neighborhoods from all of, or you can just start typing the name of your neighborhood. I think we were looking at Smith Family Homes. And let's say we have that listing that last sold in April of 2017. And I'm just going to sort of fire a wild guess off here. I don't know if this is what it would have sold for, but let's say it last sold for $450,000 and you hit enter. What you'll see here in the readout at the bottom is that based on the specific HPI models for the property type and the neighborhood that you've chosen, and the previous sold price of your specific listing based on the date that it last sold, the estimated price as of the most current data available would be that figure there. And again, just to reiterate, this is not going to take the place of your CMA, but it is going to provide a more reliable and accurate baseline to help you start out with an idea for your list price. Now, I was talking about benchmark homes earlier on. I just touched on it briefly, and I'll get back into it later when we go back to the slideshow. Um, a lot of people are asking, well, what exactly is a benchmark or a typical home in my neighborhood? How am I supposed to figure that out? Am I supposed to look at every single sold listing over the last 5 years and just try and figure out what a typical number of bedrooms is? And the answer is, of course, no, which is why we've provided that information here for you. And it's essentially just functioning as a very simple lookup table. So if you choose your neighborhoods and property types from the first dropdown, and I'm just going to choose all the features available from the second dropdown just so you can get an idea of what's available. This would be what a benchmark one-story and two-story single-family home in Smith Township actually look like. And there's a whole host of features here that you can browse. There's bedrooms, bathrooms, lot size, living area, heating fuel, and a whole host of other features. And the reason that it was important for us to give you this information, even if you don't necessarily use it all the time, is so that you know that when you see a benchmark price of just over $660,000 for a two-story single-family home in Smith Township, at least now you'll be able to say, okay, so this price reflects a home that looks like this, that has, 3 above ground bedrooms, 3 total bedrooms, 2 full bathrooms, just over 1,700 square feet in above ground living area, and so on and so forth. So that if you take a listing that, for instance, has maybe 4 or 5 bedrooms, you'll know that you'll have to make an upward adjustment on this price. But at least instead of keeping this information in a black box, we're publishing it here so that you at least have a point of reference. Now, the final tab here of the tool is another sort of very simple lookup. And for CLAR, you'll be using the bottom section down here. And the way it works is, let's say you have a listing, but you're not sure what benchmark category it corresponds to in the HPI. Well, what you do is essentially input some information that you'd get right off your listing form. So let's say you have a residential, I don't know, let's go with backsplit 4 and detached house. The MLS benchmark category that you'd want to use is either one-story detached single-family home. And then for CLAR areas not within Durham, you would use one-story single-family. Now, the reason that there's 2 separate breakouts for just generic 1 and 2 story and those that have detached or attached is because any areas within TREB, including the Durham region, have those breakouts that they have more detailed. And then for all the other areas, it's just you'd go with the 1 or 2 story single family home. Now, that's about as much detail as I'm going to go into on the tool. There is a link to a help guide in the bottom right corner of the tool, and that will take you to the CREA Learning Hub. You can also access the CREA Learning Hub through CREA's member portal. So if you go to member.crea.ca and you click on the Learning Hub, then you'll be taken to CREA's Learning Hub, where you can also access the HPI resources, which is actually hidden here just in products and technology. And since this is a recorded webinar, of course, you can go back and review this. And the MLS Home Price Index will be here. And that's where you'll find a whole host of other resources like help guide, tutorial videos, a copy of today's recorded webinar, and more available for you. I'm going to go back to the slideshow and we're going to progress again. If you have any questions, of course, I'll be taking care of all of those at the end. But before I did go on, I just wanted to make a quick note that in today's age of, very easily accessible information, we've all been exposed to the sort of do-it-yourself or Dr. Google culture where it's super easy for someone to look something up online and then consider themselves an expert in that subject. Now, every few years, we survey people who have recently bought a home or have indicated that they are planning to soon. And one of the top reasons from those who indicated that they would not use a realtor was, I can just do it myself. Now, that said, an interesting takeaway from that very same survey was what ranked in the top 3 ideal qualities of a realtor when buying or selling a home. And that was a solid overall knowledge of the housing market. Now, the HPI provides added value by giving information that you can put in the hands of your clients and actually show them what prices are doing, which is especially valuable in times of heightened uncertainty or unprecedented market conditions, kind of like the ones we've been in for the past couple of years. You've got consumers being bombarded by, 12 housing articles every day, and you've got people coming up with all sorts of their own theories on, what the Bank of Canada is going to do next and what prices should be or shouldn't be. And this provides you with the opportunity to step in and say, no, look, this is what prices are actually doing right here in your local neighborhood. And the reason that you can do that is because the HPI is an advanced statistical price gauge that was developed and maintained by people with specialized skills in urban studies and house price modeling. Now, it was also developed in consultation with representatives from Statistics Canada and the Bank of Canada. And for most boards and associations participating in the HPI, it is their go-to measure when communicating with the media and their members on price trends. It's also the price measure that we at CREA use when providing price data to lobby the government or for requests from the media. Now, market level HPI data is distributed to all the big banks and major financial institutions, as well as different levels of government across the country. Internationally, we send data out to institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, and other financial stakeholders abroad. And the reason that these institutions all want access to the data is because they know that the MLS HPI is internationally recognized as being the most accurate and timely gauge of home price trends in Canada. Now, going back to the methodology of the HPI and the meaning of a benchmark home, just for a quick minute, I did mention that the models for the HPI use benchmark homes as the basis for calculating the contribution of each feature or attribute to the price of the home. But what exactly is a benchmark home? Like, how can you actually think of it? How do you represent it? Well, essentially, it's a middle of the road representation of what a typical home would look like for a given property type in a particular neighborhood. It doesn't necessarily represent an actual home that exists somewhere, but instead it combines all the typical features of a certain property type in that neighborhood. And every single neighborhood and property type combination has its own distinct set of models in the HPI, so it's incredibly detailed. So just as a quick example, to get the number of bedrooms for a benchmark home, what we do is first collect all the sales for a certain property type in a particular neighborhood, starting from 5 years before the time the models were developed or the most recent annual review. Then we arrange all of these sales so that they're sorted from the smallest number of bedrooms to the largest number of bedrooms. And finally, we pick the one that lands right in the middle of them. And this is called the median. And that would be the number of bedrooms for the benchmark home. So a benchmark home is referred to as middle of the road because it's constructed from attributes that fall in the middle of the range of all of these home sales. And other attributes from benchmark homes, like the number of bathrooms, the living area, and the lot size, are all calculated the same way. And once all of these characteristics have been obtained to build your typical middle-of-the-road home, the models use this information to determine how each attribute will affect the price. Now, that's about as much technical detail as I'm going to go into behind the methodology. But if you ever want to know more, or if anyone ever has any questions on how the MLS HPI is actually built, you can access a detailed methodology document via the link to our MLS HPI reference materials at crea.ca/HPI. Now, we've already touched on why the HPI is the superior price measure, and now let's look at some examples of that. So these are the major price measures currently available at the national level. They've all been indexed to January 2005, which is the starting point of the HPI. Now, the average price is the most commonly quoted measure, but as we've already covered, it's also the one that displays the most volatility. Now, Teranet, National Bank House Price Index, follows a similar trend as the HPI, but you'll notice it does so with a lag. And this is because Teranet's house price index uses land registry data, which is based on closed sales. And we know the time between when a sale occurs and when it actually closes can be, 1 to 2 months, which means if you're using the Teranet house price index, you're looking at trends that are already up to 2 months old. Now, if we just look at benchmark prices, we're going to start with price trends for the board, then drill down to a major area, and then keep drilling down to the neighborhood level. You can see how the average and the median price follow the same general trend as the benchmark price, but of course with more volatility. If you look at the average price on a month-to-month basis, it becomes difficult to distinguish any useful information on turning points because of that constant up and down movement. And as we zoom in from the board to a major area, we see more volatility in the average and median prices. And this is because as the sample size of sales activity gets smaller, it becomes easier for a handful of, let's say, high-end sales to distort averages and medians from one month to the next, if you think back to the classroom of children and the basketball example. Now, these movements are not reflected in the benchmark price because, again, it is a constant quality comparison of prices. And once we get all the way down to the neighborhood level, you can see how the diminished level of sales causes extreme volatility in the average and median price. Now, if you look at the almost seismographic pattern and magnitude of some of these month-over-month changes, as a realtor, how can you accurately inform your client on price movements in their local market if you're using information based on such unstable trends? And if we move to a neighborhood that has even fewer sales, we see even more volatility introduced to the average and median prices, which are now rising and falling by up to 80% in some months. Now, this isn't reflective of what's really happening with prices in this market at any given time, but without looking at the benchmark price, the real price trends are obscured by all of that massive volatility. And finally, closing out the examples, if we look at a neighborhood that typically sees the lowest volume of sales relative to those other neighborhoods in the same area, any semblance of price trends completely vanishes from the average and median prices. Now, you might also notice that there are breakpoints in the average and median price data, and that's because there were some months when there just weren't any sales. And without sales, you can't even calculate an average or median price. However, the MLS HPI remains uninterrupted over time because, number one, it uses a moving window to sample the data, obviously with much higher weighting given to the most recent months. And number two, it can also group neighboring areas together in the models if they exhibit similar price movements for that particular property type. And it's in cases like this where the MLS HPI benchmark price really shines. So now that we've covered the advantages of using the HPI over other price measures, let's just take a look at two examples of how you can use and apply the HPI to your listing. So in this example, the property pictured was originally purchased by a client in July of 2012. There were significant renovations completed, and then it was sold in April of 2015. Now, the table shows a select list of characteristics, both for the benchmark two-story home in this neighborhood and for the listing itself. So in this example, we're looking at a home that is very similar to a typical two-story home in this neighborhood. And now let's look at what happened with benchmark prices for two-story homes in this neighborhood between July of 2012 and April of 2015. And you can, of course, generate a chart like this yourself using that performance over time line chart feature that we reviewed on the dashboard tool. So we can see that there was a small downturn early on, but prices did pick back up, and over the time span, there was a decent amount of price growth. So just to recap, this home that was bought in 2012 and sold in 2015 had significant renovations completed during that period of ownership. Now, the benchmark price for two-story single-family homes was up about 7% in that time. And if we look at what happened with the actual sale price over the same period, we find that it was up 16%. Now, why would the sale price for this home exhibit more growth than the benchmark price over the same period if its attributes were all very similar to the benchmark home? Well, the answer, of course, lies in all of those renovations that were completed during that period. If I take a look at the listing form from when this home was sold in 2015, it looks like it had new interior paint, new exterior paint, new carpeting, new hardwood floors, and the addition of an extra bedroom on the main floor. So taking all of that into consideration would make it easier to understand why the price of this particular home would have appreciated at a higher rate than the benchmark home. And of course, as realtors, you already understand the value that these improvements are going to add beyond the price growth for what is otherwise a typical home. So now in our second example, we're going to take a look at a listing that is not like the two-story benchmark home in that same neighborhood. So this home was originally purchased in July 2007 and was sold nearly 4 years later, but had no significant renovations completed during that period of ownership. Now, instead of taking a listing that's almost identical to your typical middle-of-the-road home, we're now looking at a relatively smaller and older home that has fewer features compared to the benchmark. So once again, looking at the trend for two-story benchmark prices from July 2007 to June 2011, you can see there the large decline and subsequent rebound from that financial recession. And after trending, I don't know, kind of sideways, maybe a little bit lower for about a year, prices began to rise again. So over the entire period, there is a modest amount of price growth. Now, going back to our listing example, this property that was bought in 2007 and then sold in 2011 had no significant work done in that time. So the two-story benchmark price for this neighborhood went up by just under 6%, and the actual sale price for the listing was up, well, kind of a similar 2.5%, so not too far off. And in this case, we're looking at very close changes in the price, even though the listing had very different features from the benchmark home. Now, the main difference in this example is that the actual sold price of the listing is much lower than the benchmark price of a typical two-story home in this neighborhood. And based on the comparison of attributes from the previous slide, we know that this is because the listing represents a home that is smaller and has fewer features than the benchmark home. Now, in general, this is going to mean adjusting the benchmark price downwards to reflect those changes. Now, just a quick note on the two examples I've shown you today. You might be wondering, oh, wow, gee, those weren't great examples because in one case, the percentages didn't line up, and in the other one, the prices didn't line up that well. But, rather than cherry pick two listings where the benchmark prices and the percentage changes lined up, within a decimal on the percentage and within, I don't know, a couple $1,000s on the benchmark price, I intentionally chose examples where they didn't. Because while there are many instances where the actual prices and price changes will line up very closely, because after all, the HPI is based on actual sold listings data from your own system, examples like this better demonstrate the capability and limitations of the MLS HPI. And the value in your knowledge on how to use the HPI is going to lie in your ability to understand how, certain upgrades will add more value or different features will require a price adjustment. Now, the benchmark price does provide a very accurate and reliable measure upon which to base your list price, but every home is unique. And again, the MLS HPI is not intended to replace all of that work of your CMA. So just before we wrap up and enter the Q&A period, it can be useful sometimes to focus not necessarily on the price data, but on those benchmark characteristics that I showed you in the lookup table. So for example, let's say you have a client who really wants to live in a 2-story home, but they want to shop around and see what they can get in different neighborhoods. So they might come to you and ask, what am I going to get for your typical 2-story home in the neighborhoods in this area? And you can answer that question using the benchmark characteristics feature on the dashboard tool. So this is a small, obviously, sample table using only some of the features, but it's easy to see that 2-story homes are much larger and have more features in the first neighborhood compared to the other two, which would also help explain why they are more expensive. Now, on the flip side, your client might also tell you that they really want to buy a home in a specific neighborhood. Maybe it's to be closer to a specific school or closer to family. They might be flexible on the type of home that they're willing to buy, or based on their financial situation, they might not be able to afford the type of home that they were originally considering. So once again, you can present your clients with a similar comparison, showing typical characteristics for different property types within the same neighborhood. So in the previous table 2 slides ago, we were looking at the same property type across different neighborhoods. And now we're looking at different property types that are all within the same neighborhood. And of course, you can mix and match. You can look at different property types across different neighborhoods. All of that data is there waiting for you on the MLS HPI tool. Now, we've covered a ton of ground in today's webinar, and I can appreciate it's a bit like drinking from a fire hydrant if this is your very first exposure to the HPI. But you can access a copy of this slideshow and more via the link to our in-depth training on using the MLS HPI, either at crea.ca/HPI or through the member.crea.ca site where I showed you how to click through to get to the Learning Hub, and then all of the HPI learning resources. Now, I did want to thank you for taking the time to go through today's training session. And if you have any further questions, please be sure to check out those added training resources, or you can always contact your board. And if there are any questions that they can't answer, they'll just flip them to me, and I'll make sure that they get answered as soon as possible. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And I don't know how you'd like to handle the Q&A. If people can either put their hands up, I don't believe I have control over muting and unmuting, or you can just type it in the Q&A or the chat. But I will be here just in case you're trying to think of a question or what to ask for the next, at a minimum, at least 15 minutes or however long it takes. I think that's how long the time slot was set for today.
Thank you, Chris. Again, yes, please do chat or type your question into the chat. We can address them accordingly.